We have one more talk here from Martez, who is a senior solutions engineer here at Replicated, works a lot with customers to help them figure out how to get onboarded and use the product. Martez, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. So as Mark said, I'm Martez Killens. I'm a solution engineer here at Replicated. And today I want to talk to you all about distributing your replicated Kubernetes appliance as a virtual appliance in Microsoft Azure. So today's talk was inspired by Chuck D'Antonio, who you probably heard from a few minutes ago. And in his RepliCon Q1 talk, he kind of talked about building out this virtual appliance using VMware vSphere and OVA templates. And so today I want to extend that concept and move it out to Microsoft Azure using Azure images. Before we jump into how this works and kind of the motivations for why we want to do this, let's start off and just kind of level set on some of the benefits we get with embedded cluster, right? So it's going to obviously simplify that initial Kubernetes installation. It's going to handle the day two upgrades, lifecycle management, and it's just going to kind of remove like the uncertainty around Kubernetes, right? As we know, sometimes Kubernetes can be a little bit difficult to kind of manage for people who don't have experience with Kubernetes. And then finally, we've proven it at scale, right? So we have several different customers running this in production, or sorry, vendors who have customers running this in productionalized environments. So we know that this kind of abstraction layer and level works. Now, when we talk about this virtual appliance right now, as I mentioned, Chuck kind of built this out with the OVA template. We have examples of doing this with Azure, or excuse me, AWS AMI images. And then today, I'll kind of build out this workflow with pre-configured VM templates out in Azure. We'll talk about image galleries and potentially replicating your images into different regions and a few other things like that. So let's actually take a look and get started. So the very first thing that I want to jump into, Azure has this concept of resource groups. And so you can think of resource groups as this virtual grouping of similar assets, or maybe assets that like need to live together or have similar life cycles, right? So the very first thing I'm going to do here is jump into this resource group called embedded cluster images. And then in this resource group, I actually have a couple of VM templates, and we'll dive into how I created them. But for now, I just want to point out that this is our application, which is Slacker News, the demo app that we commonly show here, Replicated. We have a channel, a replicated channel, and then we have the underlying base image. And so I have two different releases, one for our stable channel and then one for our unstable channel. Now, we have this image gallery. And so ultimately, we'll kind of build out this abstraction, but we can think of an image gallery as a container registry. And then after that image gallery, we have a image definition. And then with the image definition, this image definition, you can think of that as if we're thinking about Docker, that would be the repository, right? And then finally, this version, this is we can think of that as an image tag, right? So now what we'll do, actually, before we click into this version, we can, with this image gallery setup, we can deploy this like into different regions in Azure. And if you potentially want to like deploy this into a marketplace, you can get this closer to your customer, wherever they may be. So because Azure is obviously globally distributed. So what we'll do right now is we'll click into this 1.0 release, and then we'll go ahead and generate an generate a virtual machine based on this image that we previously created. So I'm going to click in here. We are in the sales dev subscription. So what I'll do, actually, I'm going to create another resource group to kind of group all the assets that I'll ultimately be creating. And we'll talk about those assets that I create in just a second. So I'm going to call this the Slacker News, and we'll just keep it simple and call it RG. We'll give our virtual machine a name. So I'll say Slacker News Dev 01. We're going to be deploying this out into the US East region. This is our actual image gallery with our image definition and our image version. And then we're just going to select the VM size. We'll go ahead and keep that size that we already have there. And then one thing that I'll do so we can SSH into this virtual machine I'm going to use an existing key, and I have this staged. So we'll just copy that. This is a public key. So we're all set there. And then we'll go over to disk. So now this is just giving me some recommendations that Azure kind of, tells me about like where to deploy and like what's available. I kind of understand where I want to deploy, so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of move through this and ignore these recommendations. One thing that we do want to do is the etcd has disk requirements for latency. And so ultimately what I have to do is kind of configure my disk so we can just meet that P99 latency level. So I'm going to come in here, change this to our disk size, and then we're going to set this to a premium SSD. And I'm just going to kind of set up some of these performance characteristics to make sure that we don't run into any issues when we actually do this deployment. Click OK here. And then we are just about set to go. So we're going to get a public IP, and that should be up and running in just a few moments. Okay, so we'll go ahead and create that. Now for time purposes, I kind of want to jump back over here because I've already created a VM for us in a different in a different resource group. And this VM lives here. We have a public IP, so I can grab that public IP. We'll go on port 30,000. So this is the admin console port. Okay, excellent. And so as you guys can see, I've already kind of staged this application. So this is our config screen, but this is ultimately what we would get from actually installing that virtual machine and going kind of from end to end, right? So we're going to be able to take that template and kind of spin that up from, or excuse me, take a virtual machine and spin that up from an initial template and then be able to get directly into our admin console, if that makes sense, right? So now what we can do here is we're going to jump back over to our slide deck really quick, and then we're going to kind of talk about the problem a little bit more. So right now, we have kind of talked about like creating this virtual machine from this image, but now why might it make sense to like really dive into this, right? And so, for example, one of the issues that you might run into is file system differences. So we obviously, run tests against like different distributions as they're deployed, but you might be leading or maybe get a little bit ahead of us, right? So if you have like different file system differences, potentially permissions, a version of a distribution that we haven't run through our test matrix just yet, then these could be problems. So by creating this virtual asset where we kind of already pre-configured everything, is going to kind of like get you a little bit ahead, right? Now we do have things like pre-flight checks. So our pre-flight checks will ultimately catch potentially issues like this and kind of stop any like bad things from, or potentially guide you in the case of some bad things that could be happening. But like, let's take it a step higher, right? And so, let's not rely on those pre-flight checks. Let's actually create like this virtualized infrastructure that's going to get us locked in from the very beginning, from end to end, right? Now, let's look at how this works. So there's going to be two sides. So as the embedded cluster lives today, you're going to have the part that you do as a vendor to initially build this out and install this, and then your customer is going to have their assets that they ultimately get from you, and then they're going to install it. So on the vendor side, you're going to start with your build environment. So this obviously would be releasing out into Microsoft Azure. Then you will come with the Azure image. In this case, this is an Ubuntu-based image. And then we're going to add on some automation. In this case, we're using Packer. And so Packer ultimately goes out and configures the virtual machine. And then actually we're using some ARM templates. So ARM is Azure Resource Manager, and that's how I'm spinning up like the networking and different surrounding things to get that virtual machine to get connectivity in, to set up security groups and different things like that. In the middle here, we have the replicated platform. And so both sides, we're going to have to interact with that replicated platform. So we're going to have to download assets from the vendor side to pull those into the machine. And that's what Packer actually stages. And then after Packer stages those assets into the machine and builds out that image, then your customer will ultimately get that image. And then once they start running that image, there'll be cloud init scripts. And then this is where the actual installation begins to happen. Now, there was a couple design decisions that I made when I was building this out in Azure. So if you saw before in the RepliCon Q1 talk, Chuck actually made it configurable for you to grab the license file and to actually inject credentials for the admin console. I kind of wanted to approach it from a minimal configuration aside, so customer has to do just as little configuration as possible. So because of that, one design decision is you have to actually embed the license on the vendor side when you actually create this. So you're essentially creating this for a specific customer. Now I might go back and kind of code that so you can actually inject that in. And then I guess the other piece that or implication of that is you query the VM to pull out the actual admin console password. So ultimately, once we, kind of get that up and running, we get our admin console password. We're then able to log into our app, which we just saw on port 3000, add in our password, and then we're all set to go and to potentially continue that installation from our admin console. So now let's dive into what the appliance building process looks like. So I'm going to jump into a little bit of code here. And so it's pretty straightforward. So we have pretty much four main pieces, as I was saying before. So initially we have a Azure specific Packer file. And so once again, that Packer file is ultimately what defines like how we're going to build out the image that we're ultimately going to create the templates from. Then we have ARM templates. So the ARM templates are Azure specific, similar to what you might think of with Terraform. But what we're going to do with these ARM templates are actually define like all of the infrastructure surrounding the actual virtual machine. So we have to create network security groups for allowing access into the virtual machine and into the VNet. We have to define like managed identities and a few different things like that. Then I have templates for like replicating. So we saw that image gallery that's ultimately going to allow us to replicate, pun intended, maybe not, but allow us to replicate our image across different regions. So I built that out in the replicated ARM template. And then finally, we have specific for Azure, we have cloud init scripts. So the cloud init scripts, pretty straightforward. What we do is install some packages initially. Then the downloaded assets that we were able to pull down from Packer. Once the virtual machine is running in your customer environment, we then have to actually do the installation, right? So we have to install an embedded cluster. And then at the very end, we had that where I kind of described the data disk, and we wanted to make sure that we had a data disk of sufficient size. So at that point, I actually have to go in and kind of mount the disk and test for disk and different things like that to get that disk mounted. And then from there, we have our virtual appliance that's ready to run in your customer environment. And then we are set to go. So to wrap up here, ultimately, with this end-to-end appliance like install, we want to give your customers this potential single file delivery, right? So with embedded cluster, like I said, we've taken away the uncertainty on Kubernetes, but then there's this opportunity to potentially expand that and kind of smooth everything out at the operating system as well. So we don't have to worry about different file systems. We don't have to worry about, potential policy or security things that may have changed the VM in the state that we just kind of missed or we don't necessarily understand because that's driven by a separate team. We're going to have a fully ClickOps deployment model, so we'll be able to go end to end, and your customer will be able to kind of have that deployment very straightforward from operating system on down to Kubernetes. And then we're hoping and thinking that potentially, if you potentially take this on, that this will lead to even more smooth and error-free deployments.